I'm Chief Meteorologist and Hurricane Specialist Ivan Cabrera, and here with meteorologist Dave Warren and Cindy Pressler. This is kind of like, tropics talk, right? Dave was supposed to bring the coffee, I think. That would have been nice. So we're in a generally good mood here at Next Weather because we've been looking at this monster hurricane, right? That we've all been talking about, Hurricane Lee, and we want to stay on top of it and stay on top of the messaging and tell you exactly what we're thinking with it, what it's developed into, what it's going to develop into, and what the impacts here in South Florida will be, which, by the way, of course, we're talking about indirect impacts. Nothing has changed significantly. So let's talk about the structure and zoom in a little bit closer here, because this is quite a formidable hurricane over the last just 12 hours, guys. Rapidly
intensifying, but we've known this was going to happen. This was in the forecast, and it's happening now. The question is, how long does it continue to happen for?
Right.
And I think, well, we had the cone up there a little bit, but it's
we'll show that. I just wanted to point out this eye.
It's got a huge.
It's a huge eye.
Beautiful eye.
Hurricane hunters are flying into it, and over the next several advisories, this is just going to start continuing to jump categories here. And the forecast now, we've been talking about the potential for it to explode into a Cat 5, and it looks like that's going to be likely. But what's important is that yes, there is the cone, and the cone remains to the north of the islands. This has been consistent. Has it moved a little bit south, a little bit north? Yes, but that's why we're talking about a cone, not a line, right? But it has continued to stay to the north of the islands. And when you're talking about a Cat 4, Cat 5 hurricane, the cone is important because that's where the center, that's where the eye, this is an eye tracker, if you will, and that is where the most dangerous weather is always going to be with a powerful hurricane like this.
Ivan, explain, it's narrow at the start, but look how it bulbs out at the end, and there's even a larger bulb on the end of it today.
Right, forecast errors. I mean, we're just not as good, going out, 5 days, 6, 7, 8 days, and then the forecast errors get bigger and bigger because the atmosphere continues to be simulated, and if there's an error here, that's going to be exponential down the line, and that's why we have this, this widening cone. But even at the end of the cone with those errors in miles and miles, over 200, it's still not, right over the islands here. So what we're thinking is indirect effects, but indirect effects from a Cat 4, Cat 5 are going to be significant here as this thing passes over towards the northern Lesser Antilles and Puerto Rico. So this has not changed, right? The steering currents and how the system is going to go, because hurricanes obviously don't steer themselves.
And the concern was, and you could be concerned, is that direction was northwest, but after day 4 or 5, that's when we start to see this change, because what's steering it west-northwest, that's starting to break down.
Right, and this is the important area of high pressure that we talk about, during the tropical season. It can drive a hurricane due to the west, through the Caribbean into Central America, or if it's a little bit further to the north, it's still riding that easterly flow that continues pushing it towards places like our hometown here in Florida or the eastern seaboard. If that high begins to break down, it's weaker, it shifts to the east, or if there's a trough, a dip in the jet stream, a trough that develops over the eastern U.S., then all of a sudden you don't have that trajectory going west. The storm starts feeling that and starts pulling further to the north, guys.
That's the end of the hurricane center track, so it'll continue to move west-northwest over the next 4 or 5 days, but it's what happens after that that's what we want to watch closely.
And we can see beyond the 5 days, which is why at Next Weather we like to be transparent. We're not just going to stop there, because social media, there's just all sorts of forecasts out there, and even without that, we know with our computer model forecasting, the great European forecast model, the US GFS, all have been trending to the north after that point, and the reason for that is that dip in the jet stream, those upper level winds that are going to dive down and hopefully pull this to the north. But Cindy, let's talk about some differences here over the last few model runs. We had been showing that right arrow pulling west of Bermuda and then out to sea, but now we have to introduce arrow and a track that's a little further to the west, perhaps impacting with the U.S. Down the pike.
And depending on the strength of Lee, a stronger Lee would probably get pulled back around to the east further. But now we're seeing maybe some weakening after it reaches possibly 160 mile per hour, which is unbelievably Cat 5. If it's a little bit weaker than that and goes into some cooler water, starts to weaken a little bit, how strong is that trough going to be, that jet stream? So there's still some elements here that we're not quite sure of yet.
Right, but one of the ones that we are feeling pretty good about is that regardless of which track it takes, States, the latitude is going to climb enough here where it's going to put it north of South Florida and perhaps, more than likely even north of places like Jacksonville. And it looks more of a threat, if it's going to be a threat down the line, across the mid-Atlantic and into the Northeast. And you make a great point about the weaker storm here. Another thing that a weaker storm can do is it can slow down, particularly if it starts feeling, doesn't start feeling this jet yet, and then the high begins to weaken, and then all of a sudden the strings that pull the storms have weakened and it starts slowing down. And so that could be a possibility as we talk about the model forecast here. Look at what we call the consensus here. These are all the computer model forecast, and you see a line here. You don't see so much spaghetti where they're all over the place. We like to see that. We have a good forecast here, something that we can trust more, as opposed to if the lines were all going in different directions, which, by the way, can happen as we head closer to day 5, 6, and 7.
Now, this will be Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. Yeah, watch the time closely, because that's the time where they start to separate a bit. The cone gets a little wider, but it still shows what we're thinking here.
And this just looks great, feels great just to look at that, and that turn to the north. Now, notice there are fewer lines up to the north, and the reason for that is that some of these models can only go out so far in the future. Our global models can go out upwards of 10 days. Some can go out beyond 10 days, but that's getting into fantasy physics at that point, and we really don't pay too much attention to anything after 10 days. But out 10 days, there are a few that are now indicating, including, yes, the European that we follow, a very close pass to portions of the Northeast. And that's something relatively new that we've seen over the last couple of runs.
That could be a big concern, because as the storm moves north, that wind field, that'll expand. So that's going to be a lot of water that's being pushed up against the coast.
It's going to be a big storm, just geography-wise. I mean, it's going to take a lot of space here, and so the wind field will expand, and tropical storm force winds could go all the way down into places like Puerto Rico and into the island of Hispaniola, particularly Dominican Republic and U.S. Virgin Islands, British Virgin Islands. So this is something that it looks similar to what we just showed you, the spaghetti plots here, but this is one particular model. This is the European model, and Dave's going to talk to us about what ensemble forecasting means. You're going to hear that term. You're going to see it likely on all the social platforms.
The ensemble meaning a group. We really don't have the perfect picture of what's happening at that given moment. We try our best. They fly into the storm. We have satellite pictures. We take surface observations when we can. But that one forecast model is based on that. So what they do is change that initial condition a little bit, and that's it. Each initial condition that's changed slightly, because that may give a better indication of what's actually happening, that gives us this forecast. Grouped together, you have a good idea that that's exactly what's happening, because if you're not getting a perfect picture at the start, well, you're still getting a good result. But towards the end, as they start to separate, then your confidence goes down.
And there we have it here. Even again, this is the European. It's one model, but it's different kind of simulations based on what the atmosphere is doing at hour 0. And then you start seeing more of a spread here. Again, now we're looking at some of the ensemble members here, looking at Bermuda, west of Bermuda, and perhaps even as close to the, as far as close to the northeast of the United States. Boston is going to be looking at this, the rest of the Northeast as well, with some of the latest runs from the European. And Cindy, talk to us about that one line there, because everyone's looking at that and they're thinking, wait a minute.
Yeah, that guy is the one that's standing out right now and going, hey, look at me. Yeah. This is an outlier. There's probably 51 different runs here, and all of them, there's a lot of agreement here. So the majority of them are taking it north. This one little guy here, probably not something to be too concerned about.
Right. If there were 2, 3, 4, 5, then we start paying closer attention to the fact that it may not be an outlier. But when you look at that, it's one of those things where you just kind of just discard, because it is well out of what the other same ensemble members are saying here, which again is a good move to the north, feeling that trough across eastern U.S. and riding on the western side of the high. Same thing, but with the U.S. GFS model. This is also an ensemble forecast. Now, interestingly enough, yes, it's still grouped pretty well towards the end of the forecast period, but then this is what the GFSs start doing. So bigger spread towards the end of the 7 to 10 day forecast now.
Talk a little bit about the difference between the Euro and the GFS. There's a lot of talk. Which one is better? Which one gets the,
They can both perform, really well depending on the situation, depending on the storm. We tend to notice that absolutely the European model just overperforms every time as far as the GFS. And you look at a graph, and the Euro's just on top of it here. And that doesn't mean the GFS can't nail one storm and the Euro miss one. That's happened before. But just in general, when the Euro says something, we pay attention because it just is a better model. There's just no question about it. Notice the GFS, by the way, it still has its own outlier here going out into the Bahamas. That we discard because it is not clustering. Even though this is a pretty large spread here towards the end with the GFS, it's still not in line with everything else. And so we're still looking for that nice turn to the north. It's just how quick does that happen? And does it happen, quick enough for it to completely bypass the eastern U.S. from direct impacts? We're still going to get huge waves across the East Coast. There's no question about that with a Cat 4, Cat 5 out there, although it'll begin to weaken as it moves through relatively cooler water. Dave, when we talk about this little block there of blue,
So as Franklin, you get a big storm, it churns the water up and brings the cooler water to the surface. It takes the heat out of the ocean. So oftentimes, following not too long in the past, a storm that goes right over the same area, it's encountering cooler water thanks to a hurricane that just passed by here.
And then you see the Gulf Stream nicely depicted up there with that orange, is kind of moving east, but further south, there's some relatively cooler water, not to the point where it's going to kill Lee here, but it would prevent it from continuing at a Cat 4, Cat 5 if, importantly, it was to turn to the north and get a little bit closer to New England, which is still something that that is going to be in play, and we'll be talking about that over the next several days. One last thing we want to leave you with here, and this is what we call just analog storms or analog years. This we're about to show you, there's the cone for Lee, but we went back and looked at all the Category 4 and 5 storms in early September that have formed, and this has been the outcome from all of those storms and what's happened to them and whether they've hit land or not. And so far here, none have. They have curved out. Some have gotten very close to New England with significant coastal impacts there, but none of them have hit the coast and made a landfall in the eastern U.S.
It's good to see that.
Yeah.
It's very
Absolutely.
good to see that. But things can change.
Yes. We look at climatology. We look at what's happened. We learn from history. And, history has taught us that when a storm of this magnitude in this spot develops and continues to move, it is likely, more than likely, to miss the U.S. That hit it. And here in South Florida, it is just a 0.00. I mean, it's just very low chance of all of these models all of a sudden deciding, no, we're gonna go west. We're feeling pretty good about that. Of course, if that changes, you'll be the first to know. But these are the names and these are the tracks. Interesting names. Before we had the standard list that we typically use.
Dog.
There you see. What was that from the Allied?
The military.
The military. So they went dog, easy, kind of what we have now with the different names. Of course, you're seeing more recent storms like Katia, Lewis, and Fabian. But again, all of them, by the way, missing the U.S., but some hitting places like Nova Scotia. So they're going to be paying close attention to that. All right, I think we've talked enough here on Tropic Stop. We just wanted, again, to get ahead of the message and let you know that South Florida is still looking good for this storm. We're still going to watch things closely for our friends down in Puerto Rico and for the islands for those indirect impacts. We're likely to get some rip currents here heading into next week. The question is now, where will this end up? Will it have a direct impact with the portions of the mid-Atlantic and northeastern to U.S., or does it continue curving out to sea? And we will have that answer in the coming days.